Gustavo Kinner, step over here and keep your hands away from the treatment
Yes,
console.
of course, whatever you
The
need.
TMS sessions billed to Medicare and private insurers over 4
Okay, yes, I
years.
understand. I'll cooperate completely. Whatever questions you have.
Once is a mistake, twice is suspicious. Dr. Gustavo Kinris billed Medicare for more than 24 hours of therapy in a single day on 382 separate occasions. And on the day investigators focused on most, he was on vacation in the Caribbean.
Over 8,000 sessions billed for 74 patients who never received
Wait,
one.
I'm cooperating, though. I'm doing everything right.
The math was already in the government's hands. 70-hour-long psychotherapy sessions, one calendar day, one doctor sitting on a beach in the Bahamas with his passport stamped and his laptop closed. Federal agents had spent months tracing every billing code back to a boarding pass, every claim back to a hotel folio. In under a year, Dr. Gustavo Kinris would stand in federal court in Boston and answer for $19 million in mental health treatments he never provided to patients who trusted him with their darkest hours. Before we go any further, I have to ask, how many hours are in your workday? 8, 10, 12, if you're really pushing it? This doctor billed for more than 24 hours of face-to-face therapy in a single day, on 382 separate occasions. Drop a number in the comments. How many red flags does it take before an insurance company actually stops writing the checks? And if you're not subscribed, hit that button. We cover these federal fraud cases every single week, and the pattern is always the same. Gustavo Kinris arrived in the United States as an ambitious young physician trained overseas, carrying the credentials of a psychiatric residency and a professional biography built for the American medical marketplace. He landed in Boston in the late 1990s, at a time when the city's teaching hospitals were the center of gravity for American psychiatry. His paperwork was in order. His English was clinical and precise. His letters of recommendation described a young man with sharp diagnostic instincts and a fluid bedside manner. He completed additional psychiatric training in the Boston area and began building a reputation at some of the most recognizable names in New England academic medicine. Colleagues who worked alongside him during those years described the same qualities on almost every evaluation. Articulate, confident with patients, ambitious to a degree that borders on impatient. One supervising physician wrote that Kinris had an unusual gift for making patients feel understood in a single visit. Another noted that he publishes constantly, presents everywhere, and knows exactly what he wants. What he wanted was his own practice. By the mid-2000s, Kinris had begun laying the groundwork for a private clinic that would specialize in the emerging niche of transcranial magnetic stimulation. TMS therapy had recently received federal clearance for the treatment of major depression that had failed to respond to conventional medication. The technology was new, the reimbursement pathways were being written in real time, and the field of practitioners was small enough that any physician with the right credentials could position himself as an authority. Kinris positioned himself. He acquired the equipment. He hired the staff. He built a website that emphasized his academic affiliations, his publication record, and his depth of experience with the most difficult category of psychiatric patient, the treatment-resistant depressive, the patient who had already cycled through 3 or 4 antidepressants without meaningful relief. That patient was the exact demographic that TMS therapy was designed for. That patient was also, from a billing perspective, one of the most profitable patients in outpatient psychiatry. In 2013, Advanced TMS Associates opened its doors in a professional office building in Natick, Massachusetts, a comfortable suburb about 20 miles west of Boston. The practice sat at the intersection of 2 revenue streams that would eventually define the criminal case against its founder. Stream 1 was TMS therapy itself, billed in structured session blocks over a course of treatment that typically ran 30 to 36 visits. Stream 2 was traditional face-to-face psychotherapy, billed by the hour in the standard mental health code architecture. Both streams were reimbursed by Medicare. Both streams were reimbursed by private insurers. Both streams depended entirely on the practice's word that the sessions had actually taken place. For the first year or two, by every visible measure, the practice performed exactly as a specialty psychiatry clinic should. Referrals came in, patients were treated, bills were paid. Kinross and his wife purchased a substantial home in Wellesley, one of the wealthiest zip codes in Massachusetts. He became a fixture at professional conferences. He spoke on panels. He wrote book chapters. To the outside world, he was exactly what his letterhead claimed he was: a successful academic psychiatrist running a niche practice at the leading edge of a treatment revolution. Behind the letterhead, the billing was already drifting. To understand what Kinross did, you have to understand how mental health billing actually works in the United States. It is one of the most trust-based reimbursement architectures in American medicine. When a licensed psychiatrist provides a psychotherapy session to a Medicare patient, the practice submits a claim using a 5-digit procedure code. That code specifies the length of the session, the setting, and the type of service. The claim goes electronically to a Medicare contractor. The contractor's computer system checks that the provider is credentialed, that the patient is eligible, and that the code is one the provider is authorized to bill. If all 3 checks pass, the claim is paid, usually within 30 days, sometimes within 2 weeks. Notice what the system does not do. It does not verify that the session actually happened. It does not require the practice to submit session notes with the claim. It does not cross-reference the doctor's location on the day of service against airline records or hotel folios or border-crossing data. It does not flag a psychiatrist who bills for 30 hours of therapy in a single day. The architecture assumes, at the point of payment, that a licensed physician is telling the truth about the services he provided. Private insurers operate on the same basic principle. Their claim adjudication systems are slightly different, their fee schedules are different, their prior authorization requirements are different, but the fundamental architecture is identical. Pay the licensed provider based on the codes submitted. Audit later if patterns look strange. The audit later part is where the system tries to protect itself. Both Medicare and private insurers run post-payment reviews. They look for statistical anomalies. Providers who bill dramatically more per patient than their peers. Providers whose service volume outpaces the number of hours in the working day. Providers whose patients seem to receive an unusually large number of the highest reimbursing codes. When a review identifies a pattern, the insurer sends a request for records. The provider is required to produce the underlying documentation: session notes, treatment plans, patient charts, all of it supporting the claims that had been paid months or years earlier. That is the moment the system relies on to catch fraud. That is the moment where a truthful provider produces the records and the anomaly resolves. And that is the moment where a dishonest provider has 2 options. Option 1 is to admit the discrepancy and accept the consequences. Option 2 is to fabricate the records. Kinross chose option 2, repeatedly, for years, across 2 federal agencies and a state fraud bureau. And in the end, it was not the statistical anomaly that put him in federal prison. It was the paper trail he created trying to hide it. The billing pattern began quietly in January of 2015 and grew louder every quarter that followed. Federal investigators would later reconstruct the timeline in painstaking detail. In the first months, Kinross began adding psychotherapy claims to patient files where no psychotherapy had actually been provided. A patient who came in for a TMS treatment appointment would leave the office having received 1 billable service. The claim submitted to Medicare would show 2. The extra service was a face-to-face psychotherapy session that had never taken place. The additions were small at first: 1 session here, 2 sessions there, padding around the edges of real appointments. But the payments came through. No one questioned the codes. No records were requested. And by the second half of 2015, the padding had become the whole architecture. The TMS side of the practice was the first to detach from reality entirely. Kinross began billing Medicare and private insurers for TMS sessions that had never been scheduled, never been delivered, and never been documented in any patient chart that reflected actual treatment. The scale of the fabrication was staggering. Over the 4-year conduct window, he billed for more than 8,000 TMS sessions attributed to 74 patients who had never received a single TMS treatment, not one. These were patients whose names appeared in the practice's billing system, whose insurance information had been captured at some point, whose files were being invoiced against as if they were undergoing an active course of neuromodulation therapy, when in fact they had never sat in a TMS chair. The psychotherapy side moved in parallel. Kinross began claiming face-to-face therapy sessions with a frequency and duration that had no relationship to the hours he was physically present in the office. On some days, he billed for 12 hours of one-on-one therapy. On some days, he billed for 18. On some days, he billed for more than 24 hours of face-to-face psychotherapy in a single calendar day. A mathematical impossibility that would eventually be documented on 382 separate occasions across the conduct window. The money moved fast. The house in Wellesley, worth close to $2 million, was paid off entirely. In 2018, the family purchased a second home at 4 Goose Cove Way in Madaket, on the western end of Nantucket, for just over $2.1 million. The purchases at Cartier, Van Cleef, and Arpels, and Tiffany's over the same period exceeded $600,000. Watches, bracelets, necklaces, pieces cataloged and photographed for insurance writers that would eventually become exhibits in the criminal case. And then there were the vacations. Kinross traveled, frequently, to the Bahamas, to Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic, to the Czech Republic. His passport told one story. His billing records told another. During documented vacation periods when he was physically outside the United States, he continued to submit claims to Medicare and private insurers for face-to-face psychotherapy sessions that he personally claimed to have provided. Not sessions his staff had provided, not group sessions or supervisory reviews. Sessions where Dr. Gustavo Kinross sat in a room with a patient in Natick, Massachusetts, and delivered treatment. Over 4 years, more than 900 such sessions were billed from vacation locations he could not have been in the room for. And on one particular day in July of 2017, on a beach he had flown to weeks earlier, Kinross's practice submitted claims to Medicare and private insurers for 70 separate hour-long psychotherapy sessions delivered by him personally to 70 different patients on a day when he was outside the United States, and the calendar itself provided only 24 hours in which to work. That single day would become the government's smoking gun. We are about to get into how the government actually built this case. Before we do, if you have made it this far, subscribe. We break down federal healthcare fraud prosecutions in a way you will not find anywhere else, and this channel does not let these cases get buried in a press release nobody reads. The unraveling began where these cases almost always begin, with a pattern that was too loud to ignore. By 2018, the statistical anomalies inside Advanced TMS Associates had become impossible to explain as clerical error or aggressive coding. A private insurer flagged the practice for the volume of psychotherapy hours being billed relative to the size of the patient panel. A Medicare contractor generated an internal report noting that the provider's per-day service totals exceeded the ceiling of what a single physician could physically deliver. The reports moved up the chain. In the summer of 2018, the Office of Inspector General at the Department of Health and Human Services opened a formal investigation. The FBI's Boston Division was notified. The Massachusetts Insurance Fraud Bureau opened a parallel case. 3 separate agencies, each looking at slightly different slices of the same billing architecture, began quietly assembling the record. In July of 2018, HHS OIG issued a subpoena to Advanced TMS Associates. The subpoena requested medical records for 10 specific patients whose files reflected extraordinary billing patterns. It was a routine step in the investigative process, the kind of records request that gives a provider one clean opportunity to produce actual documentation and, in most cases, resolves the concern before it escalates. Kinross did not produce actual documentation. He created it. According to the eventual federal indictment, Kinross directed office staff to generate patient records that had never existed. Session notes were fabricated. Treatment plans were backdated. Progress notes described improvements in patients who had never been treated in the manner the notes described. Some of the fabricated records referenced conversations that had supposedly taken place on dates when Kinross had been outside the United States. The office produced a package of documents in response to the HHS OIG subpoena. The package was designed to make 10 patient files look complete, thorough, and clinically defensible. The problem for Kinross was that federal investigators had already been looking at those files from a different angle. They had already pulled his travel records. They had already pulled his practice's electronic scheduling data. They had already interviewed several of the patients whose names appeared on the claims. The fabricated records did not resolve the anomaly. They created a second, entirely separate criminal exposure: obstruction of a federal healthcare investigation. A felony charge that carries its own sentencing weight and its own enhancement provisions when layered on top of the underlying fraud. The subpoena response was not the end of the investigation. It was the moment the investigation stopped being a billing dispute and started being a criminal case. Over the next several years, 3 agencies built one of the most methodical documentary records in the recent history of Massachusetts healthcare fraud. HHS OIG Special Agent in Charge, Roberto Coviello, coordinated the federal healthcare fraud investigation. FBI Boston Special Agent in Charge Jody Cohen brought the Bureau's resources to bear on the financial and obstruction components. Anthony M. DiPaolo, Executive Director of the Massachusetts Insurance Fraud Bureau, drove the parallel state effort focused on the private insurers who had been defrauded alongside Medicare. The investigative architecture was straightforward in principle and enormously labor-intensive in practice. Investigators pulled every claim submitted by Advanced TMS Associates over the 4-year conduct window. They sorted the claims by date, by patient, by procedure code, and by provider. They pulled Kinross's travel records, passport stamps, airline manifests, hotel folios, credit card charges from resorts in the Bahamas and Punta Cana and Prague. They overlaid the 2 datasets. The overlay was devastating. On date after date, Kinross had submitted claims for face-to-face psychotherapy sessions in Natick, Massachusetts, while his own credit card was being swiped at a resort bar 4,000 miles away. More than 900 such dates were documented in the eventual indictment. The July 2017 day of 70 sessions from abroad was not an outlier. It was a data point in a pattern. Investigators then went to the patients themselves. 74 individuals whose names appeared on thousands of TMS session claims were contacted and asked a simple question: had they ever received TMS therapy at Advanced TMS Associates? The answer, repeatedly, was no. Some had never heard of the practice. Some had been referred once and never returned. Some had received a single consultation and no follow-up treatment. None of the 74 had received the volume of TMS sessions that had been billed against their names. The financial trace was equally clean. Millions of dollars in insurance reimbursements moved from Medicare and private carriers into the practice's operating accounts. From the operating accounts, the money moved into personal accounts controlled by Kinross. From the personal accounts, the money moved into a paid-off Wellesley residence, a $2.1 million Nantucket vacation home purchased in 2018, and $600,000 in jewelry from 3 of the highest-end boutiques in Boston and New York. Every dollar was documented. Every asset was traced. And then there were the records Kinross had created in response to the July 2018 subpoena. Investigators compared the fabricated documentation against the practice's underlying electronic health records, its scheduling system, its billing history, and the recollections of former staff members. The fabrications did not match. Session notes referenced encounters that were not in the schedule. Progress notes described clinical improvements in patients who had never been treated. Some of the fake records contained language that appeared, on forensic review, to have been generated on dates well after the sessions they purported to document. The federal government did not need to prove that Kinross had committed fraud. The billing records did that. What the fabricated documentation proved was that Kinross knew. The confrontation was not dramatic. It was not televised. It did not involve a raid team at dawn or a perp walk in front of the practice. It happened in a conference room on a scheduled date with Kinross's defense attorney present, and it consisted almost entirely of prosecutors laying out the evidence they intended to introduce at trial. The prosecutors walked through the July 2017 day. They put the passport stamps on the table. They put the hotel folio on the table. They put the 70 billing claims on the table. They asked Kinross's attorney to explain, in any way the defense wished to explain, how a physician physically outside the United States on documented vacation could have personally provided 70 separate hour-long face-to-face psychotherapy sessions in Natick, Massachusetts on that specific day. There was no explanation. There was no version of the facts under which the claims could be true. The prosecutors then walked through the 382 separate days on which more than 24 hours of psychotherapy had been billed. They walked through the 8,000 TMS sessions billed for 74 patients who had never received a session. They walked through the 900 psychotherapy claims from documented vacation periods. They walked through the fabricated records produced in response to the HHS OIG subpoena. Kinross said little. His attorney indicated that the defense would proceed to trial. A trial date was set. The trial itself, in October of 2023, ran for several weeks. The government introduced hundreds of exhibits. The defense argued that the billing errors were the product of chaotic office management rather than deliberate fraud, and that the fabricated records had been created by staff without Kinross's knowledge. The jury did not accept the defense. On every count that mattered, they returned a verdict of guilty. 7 counts of wire fraud, 6 counts of false statements relating to healthcare matters, 1 count of obstructing a criminal healthcare investigation. The verdict was read in a courtroom that had been full every day of the trial. Kinross did not react. Sentencing was scheduled for June 7, 2024, in front of United States District Judge Denise J. Casper. The government's sentencing memorandum ran to dozens of pages. It walked through the 4-year timeline. It walked through the $19 million in fraudulent billings. It walked through the vacation period claims and the July 2017 70 session day. It walked through the Wellesley home, the Nantucket home, the jewelry. It walked through the obstruction. It asked for a sentence that reflected the scope of the conduct, the sophistication of the concealment, and the betrayal of the doctor-patient relationship that had made the fraud possible. Victim impact statements were submitted. Some came from patients who had trusted Kinross with their most fragile moments, patients suffering from severe treatment-resistant depression who had come to advanced TMS associates, believing that a credentialed academic psychiatrist would provide them with the care his letterhead promised. Several described the emotional weight of learning that the doctor they had trusted had been documenting sessions that never occurred. One described the specific injury of discovering that treatment notes existed under her name for months of sessions she had never attended. FBI Boston Special Agent in Charge Jody Cohen provided a statement summarizing the institutional harm. Gustavo Kinross lied to Medicare and private insurers, billing them for over $19 million worth of mental health treatments he never provided, and then obstructed our investigation in an attempt to cover up his crimes. In doing so, Dr. Kinross betrayed the trust of his vulnerable and mentally ill patients and taxpayers to fund a lavish lifestyle. Judge Casper's own remarks addressed the 2 dimensions the government had emphasized. The first was the exploitation of a trust-based reimbursement system that depends, at its foundation, on the honesty of the licensed physicians who submit claims against it. The second was the deliberate act of creating fabricated patient records in response to a federal subpoena, an act the court described as an aggravating factor that elevated the case beyond a straightforward billing fraud. The judge noted that Kinross had used the proceeds of the fraud to fund a lifestyle that stood in stark contrast to the population of patients his practice was ostensibly designed to serve. The sentence was 99 months in federal prison, 8 years and 3 months, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Restitution and forfeiture were reserved for a subsequent hearing. The Nantucket vacation home at 4 Goose Cove Way, purchased in 2018 for $2.1 million, was seized by the government as forfeitable proceeds of the fraud. It was sold at auction for $3.7 million, a figure that in isolation captured something essential about the case. The appreciation on the vacation property alone exceeded the price of the primary home the family had paid off with the earlier tranche of fraudulent proceeds. Advanced TMS Associates closed. Kinross surrendered his medical license and reported to federal custody. His projected release places him back into the free world in his early 60s, into a professional landscape in which the practice he built no longer exists. The credentials he trained for a decade to earn are gone, and the trust-based architecture of American medical billing has moved on without him. The patients he claimed to have treated on the beach in July of 2017 are still out there. Some of them, presumably, are still looking for a psychiatrist they can trust. This case was staggering in its arithmetic. But the case right here on your screen shows a licensed provider whose fraud went deeper and whose victims paid a cost you have to see to believe.